Good afternoon and welcome to today's Info Security Magazine webinar titled Staying on Top of Diversifying Ransomware Threats, co-sponsored by Reaqta. So my name is Benjamin David and I'm the Deputy Editor of Info Security Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's exciting webinar. Now, before I introduce you to our esteemed panelists, there are some housekeeping points to address. So firstly, I will be launching polls throughout the webinar, so please do participate. And of course, please use the question functionality. We do love a good question here. And of course, for those here on Twitter, make sure to join in the discussion by tweeting using the hashtag InfoSecWebinar. Now, this webcast qualifies members of the IASC Squared and EC Council and the ISACA for one CPE credit based on a minimum attendance time of 50 minutes. Now, to claim your credit, you will need to log into your Info Security Magazine member account 48 hours after the webcast and download your CPE certificate, which will have been generated if you meet the minimum 50-minute attendance time. You are then responsible for submitting this to your accreditation body. Please note that certificates will be processed and made available to download again 48 hours after your viewing. Now, with that being said, let's introduce you to our panelists today. So first, we have Tristan Reed, who's a senior threat researcher at Reaqta, previously managing SIEM and threat intelligence operations for managed security service providers. Tristan leverages his experience in correlating network and endpoint telemetry from a diverse range of environments and threat models. In addition, joining us today, we also have Simon Clark, who's a director of Fortinet UK. And Simon has worked in the UK industry for over 25 years, introducing Ethernet to the market in the 80s, switching in the 90s, and solid-state firewalls in 2000. Since then, Simon has been protecting his customers from emerging attacks both inside and outside the network. And unfortunately, so our third speaker, who was going to join us today, is Lisa Ventura, who is the founder of Cybersecurity Unity. She's not able to attend today owing to poor health. Now, of course, we all wish her a very speedy recovery, and hopefully she can join us in a future webinar. Now, as you all know, ransomware has swiftly grown to become one of the great security concerns for organizations worldwide. Now, behind the scenes of threat actors targeting organizations with destructive malware, a diverse illicit economy has formed, and the structure of the criminal organizations behind the attacks has flattened. Now, an indefinite number of distinct threat actors employ a wide array of techniques for any single ransomware family, ranging from requiring little skill sophistication to attack chains exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, the criminals gaining access to your network may not be the same who detonate ransomware. Now, before we jump into that topic, I want to begin by launching a poll. And that poll here is, have you ever been targeted by a ransomware operator? Of course, the options are yes, no, and unsure. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. Okay, so that poll is now live. Now, that being said, we're going to start with a presentation from Tristan. So Tristan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Benjamin. So as stated, my name is Tristan, a senior threat researcher at Reaqta. Today is obviously a topic that has been in the headlines for several years now, and it seems each year the topic of ransomware becomes more critical and more dangerous globally. There's a few underlying trends besides just the form of ransomware detonating in organizations and in crippling networks. And that's, how is that getting there in the first place? And that's where we're seeing at Reaqta a massive diversification of the threat actors involved. Something that's been widely reported is the economy, the illicit economy for cyber criminals, which has really led to a flattening structure of the organizations that we see. And that really has a lot of significance for how you're going to be detecting and stopping those threats to your network. So the first thing to really highlight is when we talk about ransomware, it's very important to know that the act of encrypting or destroying your data, that's really the final stage of what could be potentially a very long dwell time for the threat actors, potentially dwell time for multiple threat actors inside your organization. What I mean by that is the moment you're aware that there was a breach because everything was encrypted or data was exfiltrated or you got a ransomware note, it's likely that there had been multiple threat actors in your network, all pivoting off of potentially the same initial access, the initial foothold that someone got into your organization. On the chart on the right, there's actually a metric that I find most fascinating. This is from Verizon's latest incident investigation report for this year, 2021. And the reason why this is so interesting to me is it's looking at the actions based on the stage of a typical breach from what they've investigated. And the thing I would like to point out is the beginning phase, where you're seeing hacking and error and social engineering as the top actions. Why is that important? Well, because as we'll talk about a little bit more in this presentation, when the importance of threat hunting, the importance of EDR, the initial breadcrumbs that you'll find in your network that's getting that ransomware eventually onto your assets is hands-on keyboard activity, or misconfigurations in your security controls, or social engineering where credentials perhaps are compromised. These type of actions are extremely difficult for typical signature-based security controls, especially if those misconfiguration or errors involve security controls themselves. So in other words, you're not looking for malware when the initial chain of events that leads to ransomware happens. Instead, what you're looking for is the global range of TTPs that threat actors can employ. Up to 80% of breaches are typically done by organized crime. So what of that is they're financially motivated. Your network equals money to organized crime. And that's extremely important because that is obviously the principal motivator for them, but it's also still untapped for them. I've studied organized crime in different capacities throughout my career. In a different life, I followed traditional organized crime. And, one of the things that is equally credible for cybercrime is over time, the structure of organized crime flattens, it diversifies, and of course, simultaneously it grows because of the amount of money that's to be had for criminals. Now, ransomware has become a very effective way for criminals to make money. You deploy a piece of malware, you encrypt all your critical sensitive data, exfiltrate that data, wham, bam, ask for the money, you get paid, you move on to the next target. That's something that you see cyber criminals typically moving towards as they evolve. This is an impersonal force that acts on organized crime, which is they're going to continue to always pursue the most efficient way of earning revenue. And ransomware, over the course of decades of cybercrime that we've been experiencing, ransomware thus far has been one of the most efficient ways for some criminals to obtain that money. It's probably for that reason that Verizon noticed that there was a double in frequency of actions of all data breaches they investigate. Ransomware doubled in frequency. 10% of the breaches that they investigated, according to the report, resulted in ransomware. And again, this is something that happens at the end of a breach. So it's potential the same threat actors that are putting ransomware on your network are working in tandem with other cyber criminals looking to profit off of the breach into your network. Just the brief timeline of ransomware. Ransomware does go back before it was on everyone's radar. I think most notably with WannaCry in 2017. But it does seem over the last, 4 or 5 years that ransomware has been one of the growing and primary concerns for organizations. And it's for a few different reasons. One, obviously because it's destructive. Destructive malware comes with a price tag of not just your incident response, but of recovery. Of course, it also comes with the price tag of managing relations with your clients and your public. So, with that, I'm really focusing on the last few years of development, namely the evolution of the illicit economy that backs ransomware. Just to reiterate, ransomware is not a one-person show. It is, you have authors of ransomware, you have individuals responsible for getting access to your network, and you have individuals that are renting those different services. And there's many other different roles that can take part in that illicit activity that's occurring in your network. So what has happened in the last couple of years is we've noticed that this flattening structure has caused tension among the participants of these ransomware organizations. Most notably in the last year, there's been reports of ransomware affiliates leaking material belonging to ransomware operators, deploying backdoors so that they can simply hijack a session that a ransomware affiliate had been taken. So namely, with Rival ransomware this year, and then of course there was the Conti ransomware manual leak, which we'll talk about briefly as an example of the diversification in tactics and techniques and what you're really looking for. But the infighting, the leaks that we see, it's really a bad sign for security organizations. And the reason being is that's only going to push the diversification, make the waters more muddy when you're looking for your threat actors. And ultimately, when this comes down to threat hunting with your EDR, that means your threat intelligence requirements grow as well. So when we talk about the economy, there's many different roles that make up a potential ransomware operation as a whole. Currently, the three fundamental roles, in other words, different individuals or different groups that may not know each other or have very, very loose ties to each other, would be the initial access brokers. These are the threat actors responsible for gaining that initial foothold into your network. Whether they're exploiting vulnerable remote services, they are using compromised credentials, conducting phishing campaigns, whatever they need to get into your network, these are threat actors exclusively focused on that. They will perform the reconnaissance, they'll be look for potential targets, of course, and they're going to be opportunistic. They monetize this effort in turn by selling those to anyone willing to buy that initial access to your network. This can be purchased by not just ransomware affiliates, it can be purchased by anyone looking to profit off of someone else's assets. It should be noted that they don't necessarily have to sell to only one person. What that means is that it's potential that you could have multiple, sometimes competing threat actors in your network. It's not too uncommon when conducting an incident response and looking through in your forensics evidence to find that there is, in fact, multiple threat actors in a network during an incident. Then you have the ransomware affiliates. These are not individuals that necessarily are experts in ransomware. They may not be the authors of the ransomware. They're going to be the ones responsible for conducting the overall operation, but perhaps by purchasing the initial access from the brokers, renting the ransomware from the ransomware operators. And again, they come towards the end of the attack cycle for your incident. And then you have the ransomware operators. They're the ones that are going to be providing the infrastructure and the malware itself that will cause the destructive behavior. And as I mentioned during the timeline, we've seen some tension in the last couple of years between the affiliates and the operators. So it's important to note that during a ransomware incident, the threat actors involved may be competing or conflicting with each other, something that is going to cause even more headaches for security, for your business. Ransomware operators tend not to be as numerous as you would see with initial access brokers or ransomware affiliates, but however, the realm of ransomware families out there continues to grow each year. And while I'll be talking about the TTPs to get the ransomware onto your network, ransomware itself is a continuous evolving solution where ransomware authors look to innovate to speed up the execution of their encryption, defeat capabilities designed to block ransomware or to detect it. Just as we see evolution in techniques to get into your network, we're seeing an evolution in techniques to encrypt data faster, become more destructive, ensure that backups and contingency plans that you may have do not work. Now, this economy, again, is driven primarily by the illicit revenue, potential illicit revenue out there. And I would think that it'd be safe to say that cyber criminals have not yet tapped the full potential of revenue that's out there for them to get. So what that means is that we're going to continue to see a diversification in this economy. We're going to see more roles. We're going to see more evolution in techniques within each of those roles. And that really makes the threat hunting task that much harder. It makes your threat intelligence team that much more critical for staying on top. Because quite simply, you can't look for everything at the same time. You need to be focused when you're conducting your threat hunting and working with your EDR platforms. So this is really where the EDR platform begins to shine, because when you're looking for a diversification in techniques, you may not know exactly what you need, so you go to your threat intelligence to stay on top of the threat actors and their TDP targeting your industry, or at least organizations similar to your profile. The entry for attack, as I mentioned, varies. You have your phishing, compromised credentials, exploiting vulnerabilities in remote services. This is something that we've been seeing a lot lately, especially with threat actors where they're taking highly publicized critical vulnerabilities and then just going out there and seeing what sticks with those exploits that are also publicly available. And then, of course, through malicious documents, maldoc, something that I take a look at every day. And then once they're inside your network, the work's not done. But then this is also where you're looking at multiple threat actors. They're going to want to pivot off that initial access, conduct lateral movement, find those juicy, sensitive files that would be prime for targeting with ransomware. Now, over the last few years, as everyone has been discovering, they're not just encrypting your data because more and more organizations are getting ahead of themselves with being able to back up data. Some companies and organizations are taking more stringent policies around negotiations for ransomware. They need more leverage. Ransom requires leverage. It requires fear. And if exfiltration or if encryption is not enough, exfiltration certainly will be. Before they push that detonate on ransomware, they're going to be working actively to exfiltrate all that sensitive data, potentially for the ransom negotiations. And if ransoms fail to be paid, of course, trying to drag the organization through the mud by publishing all of that stolen data. So, how do you stay on top of this diversification of TTPs? When really you're dealing with unknown and indefinite number of threat actors in your network, literally every TTP can be used out there and something you need to look for ransomware. So how do you stay on top of that? It's absolutely critical to have visibility on your endpoints. And I don't mean just having simple Windows events coming in that you're correlating with your SIM. I mean, you want minute, granular details of what the processes are doing, what file operations are occurring on your endpoints, and hoping to catch the incident as close to the beginning of the cyber kill chain as possible with those initial access brokers. By the time you get to ransomware, the actual ransomware operation, it's potential that damage has already been done in some regard. So you want to catch them as early as possible. And EDR is the best tool to make that happen. So when you're working with an EDR, it's important to distinguish between threat detection and threat hunting. These are two terms that are often within the industry, especially within SOCs, used interchangeably. And it's because they overlap with each other, both in the tools and the processes that are being used. The key difference between threat detection and threat hunting is a proactive process. You take the initiative. Whereas threat detection is you're waiting for that alert to come in. You're waiting for your traditional AV alert. You're waiting for your IDS alert. Typically, you're going to be looking at that into a SIM or an XDR. But one of the problems with threat detection is you're looking for the known. Think about it. With threat detection, it's automated correlation. How do you correlate automatically? Well, you have to have your data points to correlate on, which means the threat has to be known. And the typical process is you deploy your rules, your correlation, or perhaps those come with the solution itself. An alert gets generated. You take a look at that alert. And of course, you may have a large volume of alerts coming in. It's going to cause alert fatigue. And then you start your incident response. With threat hunting, you're leveraging your threat intelligence. You're taking a look at what's happening in the threat landscape. What type of threat actors are targeting a profile like your organization? What are those TTP? That allows you to sort of zoom in on what you want to look for. You then develop a hypothesis. You assume that your network has already been breached. You then look for those for evidence that would support your hypothesis on that. And if everything is successful in a threat hunt, in other words, you're able to validate your hypothesis, you can certainly feed that back into your threat detection. But so why is EDR so critical, especially when it comes in contrast to traditional AV or other security controls like network logs? Well, first is the now standard use of living off the land techniques. Leveraging legitimate binaries, executables on your network for malicious purposes. More and more, we see the use of legitimate applications being used for conducting lateral movement, conducting discovery operations, deploying the malware across your network. You need to be able to know what legitimate tools are being used and what is the behavior around those tools being used. Of course, you need to have retention, which the EDR platform should be providing you. This is actually critical, especially when we go back to what I was talking about a few minutes earlier when we were discussing the diversity of the economy and how the initial access brokers, the ransomware affiliates may not even work together. Because of this economy, the dwell time in your organization before ransomware is triggered could potentially be many, many, many months. Many organizations only find out that they've been compromised by ransomware when they're reading the ransomware note. Of course, if you're looking at the note, then things are too late. The damage has been done. You're now looking at potential data breach, worrying about recovery of your data, especially the data that's been exfiltrated. So when you're conducting your threat hunting, you really want to start as close to the kill chain as possible, which means you need to have retention of those logs. And you need to have the ability to effectively parse through all of those events. If I am looking for the chain of events that led to lateral movement, I want the minute details of the binaries, executables that were used by the threat actors. I want to know what the operations on the registry were. I need to have that retention. And then, of course, monitoring. Monitoring is a critical aspect for threat hunting. Because as you conduct that successful threat hunt, as I said, that can feed back into your threat detection. You should have an EDR platform that can work with these custom correlations. In addition to the capabilities of anomalous behavior, automated detection of anomalous behavior, you should have the ability to write your own complex and advanced correlation rules to look for those unknown threats that tie into your threat hunting process. So first example to use when we're talking about the diversity of TTP. Several months ago, there was a leak by a ransomware affiliate that was working with the Conti ransomware group, presumably disparaged or otherwise unhappy. Regardless, they leaked the materials that were handed out to a ransomware affiliate. What I found most interesting about this leak is that it is a step-by-step guide for individuals of low skills. It provides you with the techniques you need for discovery, for lateral movement, working with common tools such as Cobalt Strike Beacon. When they may not necessarily have that knowledge, those skill sets, this manual can give you a step-by-step guide. Why does that matter? Because they're looking to the lowest common denominator of threat actors that can act as ransomware affiliates. That broadens the potential of people participating in this criminal activity. The other thing is from our own observations, when our EDR is detecting anomalous behavior, is we're seeing copy and pasted verbatim these types of operations. Literally taking from this manual, copy and pasting, throwing it into the terminal and seeing if it works. And based on reporting that's out there, it seems like that's a common observation for a lot of security professionals. But it also highlights that there is going to be a diversity in not just the tool sets, but in what is possible to be looking at. You're looking for low-skilled threat actors, all the way up to individuals writing their own exploits for critical vulnerabilities. So when you're working with an EDR, what does it mean to have the granular details you need? Well, so for example, something that we've noticed in the last couple months or a few months is yet more examples of ransomware affiliates and operators working with DLL hijacking. What security controls do you have that can give you the granularity to see when a executable drops a module and that same module is being loaded by another application? You should have the ability to correlate on that quite easily. And in addition to that, you should have the ability to follow the processes every step of the way. What were the file operations being done? Again, ransomware fundamentally is a process on files. And you should have the visibility to what files are being read and written on your endpoints. Now, with that being said, I think we're going to transition back to Benjamin to start our Q&A.
That's fantastic, Tristan. Thank you, Rowan, very much for a very, very interesting presentation. So before we actually jump into the Q&A, I'm going to remind everyone about the first poll, and I'm going to bring up the results here from the first poll. So just to remind everyone, that question is, have you ever been targeted by a ransomware operator? Now, 17% of you have said yes, you have. 65% have said no. And then 17% have said unsure. Now I'm going to launch our second poll of the session now. And that question is, of course, do you currently use an EDR solution? Now, of course, the options you have is just like before, yes, no, and unsure. So that poll is now live. So please do vote. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now pull this presentation down, bring us all on full screen, and start with the first question with our Q&A. So what I want to kind of start the discussion with is by asking, what are some of the most popular ransomware techniques by threat actors today? And can I go to you first, Simon, on that question?
You can. So I think what we're seeing is the same old viruses being churned out time and time again. The difference is that they're being automated. So that's malware as a service. And hopefully people with up-to-date AV pick it off. What we're also seeing is the same old viruses having new signatures, which is a little bit more difficult for the AV companies to keep up with. What I'm also seeing is a growth of third-party threat. So, and that's split into two ways. One is your supply channel, and one is the third-party products that you're using. So again, SolarWinds is a great example of a third-party threat, and it's very difficult for companies to control that because by its actual nature, it's coming from a third party. You've got a new set of actors out there, Hive, who was set up this year. They seem to be just churning out your standard viruses, unrelenting, and they don't care about healthcare. So whereas some actors have kind of steered clear of some essential services, Hive don't seem to care. But they're at the moment, they're churning out fairly standard ransomware. But if we think about what Tristan was talking about how once they're in and they've taken control, that software can stay inside the network for days, weeks, months, and move around, move laterally. And that's when it starts to change and morph into different named files with different signatures, which again is very difficult for the AV products to pick up. But I'm also seeing a newer approach where, let's face it, most antivirus, most attacks start with phishing. And the trouble with phishing now is, for hackers, is there's lots of tools out there to scan them, and there's tools like Reaqta to look to see if they're doing something anomalous. So files come in that are not anomalous. There's nothing wrong with them. It might be an invoice that says you owe this much money, and what they're trying to do is to encourage you to ring them. And when you ring them, you release usernames and passwords and login details. And then if we go back to Tristan's diagram of all the little squares and boxes, that's when they start doing password guessing. And then it becomes very difficult again for anybody to detect it because it looks like the genuine person is logging in. So then we've got to wait for them to do something nefarious for something like Reaqta to pick them up. You've got the, just last week actually, Robinhood did exactly that. So they managed to fool a support employee on a stock trading platform to release login details. And lo and behold, 7 million email addresses and customer details were released or exfiltrated. That's probably all I've got at the moment.
Fantastic, wonderful. A lot of juicy material to work through. Tristan, can I go to you on that same question as well? Obviously, Simon did a really good job at providing an exposition of various most popular techniques threat actors are using to deliver ransomware. From your perspective, I wonder if you can kind of focus a bit more on that, on those techniques that are most popularly used by ransomware actors.
Mm-hmm. As mentioned by Simon, phishing is still the most prevalent. Targeting organizations via email, being able to get a malicious document to be executed, or simply siphoning credentials from those users. Those tend to, and they still are, probably one of the most common ways of getting initially into the network. Ransomware operators, they're getting more proficient with the speed of the encryption. They're learning that new ways of being able to destroy or to encrypt data before traditional security controls can stop them before you can stop them. So ransomware operators, on one end, their newer techniques is to encrypt only portions that are necessary of your assets. On the other end, we're also seeing a large number of exploits against remote services. This is something that's been happening quite often. We saw that certainly in this last year, where whether it's through an exploit in a vendor's third-party service, to be able to get initial entry into that way as well. And those are quite tricky to catch because, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, when there is an issue with your security controls or when there's an issue with your third-party services, where does threat detection come into play with that? It's much harder for threat detection to provide you with any benefit. And that's really when you're dealing with those types of threats, having that visibility to see those exploits take place and that you didn't even know existed, that's critical.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Tristan. Yeah, so, obviously during your presentation, you talk about the advantages of EDR solutions with respect to ransomware. And I'm hoping if I can kind of dig a little deeper in that topic. So obviously most organizations are going to be concerned about ransomware, and they will be naturally thinking about what solutions are there that can protect me against ransomware. And we see, of course, ransomware increasing exponentially, so there's a genuine concern. What is it about an XDR that really provides organizations with a strong defense against ransomware? So if I can go with you first, Tristan, on that question.
Yeah, so there's really a few things to highlight. One, with anti-malware solutions that are looking for very specific signatures, of course, those are easily defeated. When you have an evolution of design by ransomware operators, when you have the increasing use of living off the land attacks, and then when you have the continuous evolution of the tool sets that they're using that are malicious, anti-malware solutions quickly become much less powerful for an organization. So you need to have visibility into those legitimate applications, how they're being used. If they're already on your system, because they have to be there for your IT administrators, you need to know how they're being used, and you need to have visibility of anomalous behavior. That's something that only an EDR solution can and must provide to be an effective EDR solution. You're looking for behavior. The other thing is, again, going back to what I was saying about ransomware file operations. At the end of the day, regardless of the evolution of techniques, ransomware is an action on your files. And I think anyone that's been doing security monitoring for a number of years understands the volume of file operations on any given system. You need to have an EDR solution that can automate the analysis of those file operations, really showing you what is important. What is an important file read? What is an important file write? What files are being created? And that is something that exclusively an EDR can provide you at the moment, where you're seeing not just that the files are being operated on, but the processes that are operating on those files.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Tristan. So yeah, obviously the processing aspect and the visibility, I'm sure other things as well, seem to really provide EDR with a unique selling point. So Simon, on that topic, what do you think about what it is regarding an EDR that makes it a good defense against ransomware attacks?
Well, Tristan's done a good job here, so I'm going to kind of reiterate what he said, but it's all about reducing the mean time to detect and the mean time to remediate. So when you think if a piece of malware is in your network for 256 days, which is one of the figures that's banded, it depends which report you look at, but that's a figure banded about. Think of the damage that someone can do. If a burglar could come into your house for 256 days and then work out exactly what they wanted to take, that's what they're going to do when they finally pounce. If you can reduce that mean time to detect down to days, if not hours, then it becomes a smash and grab. All they can do is get in, see what they want to do and get out, or just infect 1 or 2 machines, which then becomes manageable for an well, with the best intent, manageable for most organizations. So, you know, with EDR, what you're looking for is day 0, suspicious or anomalous traffic. And as malware morphs and moves around the network, that's the kind of unusual traffic that you're looking for. And actually, that's probably it, really. You know, Tristan covered it.
There's actually one thing that reminded me, you know, is that there's actually a silver lining with the diversity of the economy and actions that take place before ransomware. It's that you have time and you have breadcrumbs to follow before that destructive part of the operation occurs. You know, because especially now with the trend where exfiltration before encryption is becoming the norm, that is something that should be quite visible to your EDR platform. You know, for example, with Reaqta EDR, we'll alert on anomalous uploads and downloads, even through a tunnel, right? There's going to be more for you to find before the destruction takes place. And again, you know, going back to the EDR can help you take advantage of that dwell time. Reducing the mean time to detect and to respond essentially means exploiting the reality of this diversifying economy.
Fantastic, thanks for that, guys. Yeah, I think obviously the monitoring aspect of an EDR is something that I want to kind of focus on, and now just because I think there's so many people who are really interested in EDRs, but perhaps don't quite know exactly what's going on behind closed doors. So would love to kind of thematize that in a moment. But before I do, I would like to get the results of the second poll. So again, just to remind ourselves what that poll is. So do you currently use an EDR solution? Now, interestingly, 41% of those who voted has picked yes, they do. 29% of you have said no, and another 29% of you said you're unsure whether you're using an EDR solution. So quite interesting results there. And what I'm going to do now is launch our final poll of the session, which is for those without an EDR solution, do you intend to invest in one? Now the options are yes within 0 to 6 months, yes within 6 to 12 months, yes 12 plus months, unsure, and no. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. So again, please do vote. That being said, I am going to ask you all another question, and that is, of course, considering the need to get the necessary intel when such attacks occur, what monitoring capabilities specifically does an EDR provide? Can I start with you on that point, Simon?
Yeah, I think I was probably going to go down the route with a question like that of maybe some of the things that EDR isn't finding and what you might have to do around that. So if we think about React, Tristan's done a great job of talking about looking for malicious code and looking for unusual traffic, and then reporting those discoveries in a contextual fashion so that your support teams can make sense of it. And he's also talked about visibility being absolutely key. When we've done network assessments of organizations, typically we've found between 20 and 40% more assets than they think they've got. Now, what that means is you've got potentially 40% of assets that must be vulnerable, because if you don't know you've got them, you're not managing them. And if we go back to back to Tristan's chart of all the entry points, guessing passwords and phishing, one of them was looking at vulnerabilities within the company's organization, and that is where you find them. That's the the shadow IT, that's the stuff that's potentially your employees have plugged into the network without telling you, circumventing your security policies and IT policies, assuming you have them, and also legacy stuff that's just sitting there and it's just whirring away and people have forgotten about it. It could be sitting under somebody's desk, but it hasn't been patched, probably hasn't been logged into for months, if not years. And those are the elements that EDR needs to be looking at and monitoring and reporting back big style, so that the companies can either get rid of them or patch them up to a secure state. I think there's other elements of things like dark web info. So EDR, well, Tristan can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically EDR is looking at your network. When we start thinking about the network, the attackers guessing passwords, how do you know if your emails have been compromised and published in the dark web? So again, we do scans of people's domains and email addresses, and we find just dozens of individuals whose emails are exposed in the dark web with clear text passwords. And the same names pop up numerous times. So we see the same person, same email address, and a similar password, which makes it so easy for the attackers to do the password guessing in the first place. Typically, it's a pet's name with a number at the end, and the number changes as the years change or the months change. Very, very poor hygiene. And EDR, I don't know if Reaqta does this actually, but if you're looking at people's password hygiene, then that's a good step to securing your security a little bit more. There was another element, which is again in the dark web, where not only do we see passwords, but we see usernames and credit cards and full addresses. And again, that makes it so easy for hackers to just have a really easy place to start their attack on an organization. And just one thing, it was quite interesting to see that on your poll, 65% of people said they hadn't been targeted. And I think the question would be, how do you know?
Very, very good points. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, so obviously you covered a lot of interesting monitoring capabilities there. Tristan, can I kind of pull you in on this now? So again, companies that are interested in EDR will probably want to know, okay, what can EDR exactly monitor? So I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack that as well and tell me what it is exactly an EDR can do in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's going to really obviously depend on EDR vendors. The core fundamental, the commonality among EDR is to give you visibility beyond just looking at signatures of a file. But because activity, even on a simple endpoint used by an employee that's not much of a power user, that endpoint is still going to have a lot of telemetry, right? So something that EDR must and should provide is a way of being able to automatically parse through this fire hose of data, right? So it should alert on anomalous behavior. So going to an example of stolen credentials, where you have an employee leveraging tools that very much look like a living off the land type of attack. The EDR should not only alert you on that, but that should begin gathering and automatically collating the forensics evidence necessary for your incident response. That cuts down significantly on time in the meantime to detect and respond. Of course, going through those alerts, having a EDR platform with AI capabilities to help you triage really saves a lot of time on your SOC. So it's not just about getting the visibility, processes and files in your network. An EDR, really to be an effective EDR, should be able to link up that behavioral analysis and provide an automated triage for you as well.
Great, thanks so much for Tristan. So obviously we've been hearing a lot of good things about an EDR, and again, putting my critical hat on, I'm sure companies listening will be thinking, okay, that all sounds really great, but what are some of the limitations around an EDR, and also what can be done to overcome those limitations? So can I go with you first, Tristan, on that topic?
Mm-hmm. I think the main weakness that would exist in any EDR is going back to describing ransomware as file operation, right? Because of how frequently files are accessed on any given endpoint, there's going to be a trade-off with performance. How closely are you monitoring file activity, and how aggressive are your policies with those file operations? The more monitoring, the more aggressive of a policy, that requires cycles for agents to be able to operate on. And because ransomware is so aggressive and it's just strictly file operations, that is going to be the weakness. The weakness itself being the trade-off, security versus performance.
Great, thanks, Tristan. And Simon, can I go to you on that question as well? So, limitations of an EDR, and what can actually be done to overcome these limitations?
So, I think what EDR is doing is it's looking for the bad stuff. That's basically, once you've been breached, it's looking for the signs of that. And what we should be looking at as well is how to protect the environment before it gets attacked. So it's a layered approach to security. There's no one solution for everything. So there are multiple products and solutions that you need to go for. I think there's one thing that EDR is going to struggle with, which is insider threat. How do you stop an individual downloading a file onto their laptop, which they're probably entitled to do, emailing it to their Hotmail account, or sticking it on a USB, or putting it onto a hard drive somewhere and taking away company IP? How do you stop employees from deleting critical files? If they wish to be disruptive to a business, they can delete essential files. I'm uncertain as to how much full visibility EDR can give. I'm an advocate of EDR, by the way. I think you should definitely be doing EDR, but you need other tools to give you the full visibility. So where we talk about passwords, how many times has somebody logged into a machine? If they haven't logged into it for 60 days, why have they got access to it in the first place? Actually, do they still work for the organization? And if they don't work for the organization, have you wiped their credentials off the system so that if a hacker gets their credentials, they can't use them? I think there are things that, like supply chain issues, where that's off your network. That's stuff your customers are potentially receiving from you, or looking like you but not being you, and that's off the network. And EDR and antivirus and all your perimeter products, lovely perimeter products that you've got, aren't going to pick that up. And I think that to overcome some of this, you can use things like staff awareness training, send them simulated phish, educate them in a positive fashion. They're your first line of entry, if you will. So if they're on the lookout for suspicious looking stuff, then it won't get into the network in the first place. I think if you're from a supply chain point of view, how do you stop your customers receiving spoof emails? This is something I'm seeing a big growth of at the moment, or maybe it's just a more awareness of it. But you wouldn't know if your customers were receiving an email that looked exactly like Benjamin from InfoSec Reed Expo. You wouldn't know if people were receiving that. even though it would look exactly like you. But there are tools like DMARC. Set up your DMARC records, you can stop that from actually ending up in your supply chain's inbox. Are you being impersonated? So how do you scan the internet to make sure that your domain hasn't been set up with a subtle change, a small letter change, and now they're doing fraudulent stuff on your behalf? Again, EDR is unlikely to pick that up, so EDR needs to be integrated to these other layers of capabilities.
Fantastic, some really, really good points there. Yeah, when you mentioned recruitment, proper training is what that came to my mind. One of the things that we do quite often here in Info Security Magazine, we have quite a lot of internal training as well, which is great. So what I'm thinking we can do right now is actually get the results of our final poll before I ask you both the final question. So let me just remind ourselves again what that question is. So for those without an EDR solution, do you intend to invest in one? Now, according to the results, so we've got so 0% of you have said yes within 6 months. 20% have said yes within 6 to 12 months. 0% have said yes 12 plus months. A whopping 40% of you are unsure, and 40% of you have said no. So the last question, perhaps quite relevant actually to that, would be for companies that perhaps are on the fence, or companies that do want to invest in an EDR, exactly what their first protocol is. How do they get the process moving? So what advice would you give? So Simon, can I start with you first on that question, and then I'll give Tristan the final word.
I'll try and make myself quick in that case. Firstly, I would say you should be doing EDR. It's the next layer over AV. The challenge with EDR is that it's likely to generate more traffic, more alerts. So you need to make sure that your teams are not overstretched already, and that they have the skills to be able to interpret the results. Or if they're not, you talk to Reaqta and they sell you another layer to their service. But in the interest of time, that's probably my one bit of feedback.
Fantastic. And Tristan, I'll give you the final word. So again, companies interested in an EDR solution, what advice would you give them? Oh, we can't hear you, Tristan. Are you on mute?
I apologize.
No
certainly, as I mentioned, that the volume of alerts and telemetry that's there, you need an EDR solution that can help triage that for you. Through an automated process, being able to find that needle in a haystack should require some sort of machine learning or AI type assistance with that process. The visibility is critical, but the visibility without such a process can be intimidating.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so I see we still have a minute and a half to go. So I'm going to ask you both for a very, very quick question, a quick fire question, which would be, what, in terms of ransomware techniques that you predict will appear in the future, do you have any thoughts around that? So Simon?
Well, no, I can't see into the future, but I can see what's going to be affecting us in the coming months. I think a lot of e-commerce sites are not giving the MageCart actors the attention that it needs. And for those who don't know what MageCart is, that's JavaScript insertion on your website. It's where the hackers steal real-time information as the user puts the data in, whether that's credit card information or username and password. It's skimmed straight out of their browser, not off the web server. There are tools out there that can detect it and stop it. However, your standard products, including EDR, and your WAFs and all the other clever stuff that you might have in there are unlikely. In fact, they won't pick it up. And I think we'll see a lot more e-commerce companies suffering from that kind of attack in the coming months.
Okay, and Tristan, the final word. Ransomware techniques that you can predict we'll be seeing in the near future.
I think we're going to see them up the ante for the level of pain that organization is going to feel. If it comes down to ransom, it comes down to fear and pain for the organization. They moved on from encrypting to exfiltration to throw that, put those publicly available. We're going to see an evolution in that. They're going to want to make it as painful as possible for an organization, so they're more incentivized to pay the ransom that they're asking for.
Fantastic. Well, we've learned a lot about the value and the necessity of having an EDR solution. So thank you, of course, Tristan, for joining, and of course to you, Simon, as well. And a big thank you to Reaqta for sponsoring this webinar. I found it very, very educational. This webinar will be on demand after, so you can always watch it, and please do share it as well. And this webinar will now end. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.